The cabin sat at the edge of the lake, tucked between tall evergreens and weathered boulders that had stood guard for centuries. It wasn't new, nor was it grand, but it carried with it a sense of belonging, of quiet sanctuary away from the humdrum of daily life. For years, it had been a retreat for my wife and me, a place where city noise could not reach, where the weight of responsibilities faded with every ripple of water that lapped against the dock. Yet, in this tranquil setting, trouble had been brewing for months, and the real storm began with something as simple as a lock. The cabin fell under the jurisdiction of a homeowners association. The HOA claimed that their presence preserved the beauty and order of the lakeside community, but in practice, it often felt like a heavy hand meddling in the lives of residents. Rules about what color you could paint your shutters, how tall your grass could grow, or even what kind of car you could park in the driveway were enforced with a zeal that bordered on obsession. And among the officers of the HOA, there was one in particular who stood out, a woman whose self-importance and relentless enforcement had earned her the nickname everyone used behind closed doors, the Karen of the lake. For months, she had been keeping an eye on our property, scribbling notes whenever we visited, taking pictures if the trash cans weren't aligned in the precise way she demanded, and sending passive-aggressive letters about every minor infraction she could dream up. At first, we ignored her antics, brushing them off as nothing more than the usual HOA pettiness. But her fixation on our cabin soon crossed into something deeper, something more personal. It started when she learned that we had changed the cabin's front lock. The old one had grown rusty with years of rain and frost, and on more than one occasion it had jammed so badly that we had to fight with the key just to get inside. So, during one of our weekend visits, my wife decided enough was enough. She bought a new, sturdy lock, and within an hour the cabin had a fresh line of defense against both weather and unwanted intrusion. To us, it was nothing more than maintenance, but to the HOA, it was apparently a direct violation. 2 days later, a letter arrived in our mailbox. The envelope bore the official HOA seal, stamped in red as if it carried the weight of a federal mandate. Inside, the notice accused us of altering the cabin's exterior without prior approval, of disregarding community standards, and of undermining the authority of the association. The punishment: a fine to be paid immediately, and a demand that the lock be removed and replaced with one consistent with the community's approved fixtures. The irony was laughable. This was a lock, not a neon billboard or a towering fence. Still, to the Karen of the lake, it was a personal victory. My wife wasn't rattled. She had dealt with bureaucracy before, the kind that came with her line of work, though the HOA had no idea about that yet. Instead, she tucked the letter into a folder where we had been collecting their endless stream of notices, shook her head, and carried on. But ignoring Karen was like throwing fuel on a fire. Days later, she escalated her campaign. She began pacing in front of the cabin whenever we were there, peering at the door as if the lock itself offended her, muttering under her breath and snapping more photos than a tourist on vacation. The breaking point came one crisp morning when my wife arrived at the cabin alone. She had driven up to prepare it for an upcoming family gathering, bringing groceries and fresh linens with her. As she pulled into the driveway, she noticed the Karen standing nearby, arms crossed, eyes glued to the door. Without so much as a greeting, the woman stormed off, phone pressed to her ear. Minutes later, 2 patrol cars rolled up the gravel road, crunching stones beneath their tires. The HOA had called the cops. It would have been absurd if it weren't. So intrusive. Imagine standing on your own property, watching officers step out of their vehicles with the weight of official authority behind them, all because a lock on your door didn't meet some imagined community guideline. Neighbors peeked from behind their curtains, whispers echoing across the yards, as though a true crime was unfolding before their eyes. Karen stood tall, chin raised, certain that this would be her crowning achievement. She had finally caught Us finally proven that we were rule breakers who needed to be humbled by the law. The officers approached my wife. Their expressions caught somewhere between annoyance and disbelief. To their credit, they seemed puzzled by the call, but duty-bound to investigate. Karen wasted no time launching into a tirade about how the cabin lock was unauthorized, how we had violated the sanctity of the HOA covenant, and how justice demanded intervention. It was an absurd spectacle, one that might have been laughable had it not been so invasive. My wife listened quietly, letting the woman rant, her calm demeanor in stark contrast to the hysteria unfolding around her. She knew this wasn't just about a lock. It was about power, about control, about someone who thrived on conflict and attention. And in that moment, my wife also knew that the HOA, and Karen in particular, had made a mistake. Because what they didn't realize was that she carried with her an authority far greater than their petty rules, but she didn't reveal it just yet. Instead, she stood still, letting the tension mount, letting Karen bask in what she thought was her triumph. The officers asked questions, their pens scratching notes onto notepads, though even they seemed unconvinced that a lock could warrant this kind of response. The air was thick with anticipation, with the sense that something was about to break, and my wife, calm and composed, was waiting for the exact moment to make her move. For Karen, this was the pinnacle of her campaign, the moment she had envisioned, countless times as she plotted ways to corner us into submission. But for my wife, it was just the beginning of a reckoning that would shift the balance of power entirely. And so, as the officers turned to her, asking for identification, my wife reached into her bag with deliberate precision. What she would reveal in the next instant was something no one in that cul-de-sac expected, least of all Karen, because when the badge caught the light of the morning sun, every whisper fell silent. The glint of the badge was enough to shatter the illusion of authority that Karen had been clinging to so desperately. For a long, breathless moment, everything stood still. The officers froze mid-step, their brows rising as they registered what was in my wife's hand. It wasn't just an ID card, not just a laminated piece of plastic. This was a federal badge, one that commanded a level of respect far beyond the small-scale theatrics of an HOA dispute. The reaction was immediate, like a ripple across still water. The officers straightened, their postures shifting from casual enforcement to sharp, professional attention. Karen, however, didn't understand what had just happened. At first, she smirked, certain that my wife was bluffing, maybe holding up some kind of prop to embarrass her. But the smirk faltered as she saw the change in the officers' faces. Their eyes flickered with recognition, and their silence spoke louder than anything they could have said. My wife didn't wave the badge around or gloat. She simply held it long enough for them to register, then tucked it back into her bag with the same calm precision she had shown all along. The balance of power had shifted, though Karen didn't yet comprehend the gravity of it. She was too far gone in her obsession, too convinced that her word carried more weight than anyone else's. She began shouting again, demanding that the officers do their job, that they arrest my wife for violating HOA regulations. The irony was staggering. Here was a woman trying to weaponize local law enforcement over a cabin lock, blind to the fact that the person standing in front of her wielded far more authority than she could ever imagine. The officers exchanged glances, their hesitation growing. They weren't about to cross a federal agent, not over something this trivial. One of them stepped aside, murmuring into his radio, while the other began gently but firmly trying to steer Karen back. The scene was unraveling, not in her favor, and it was clear from her rising pitch that she knew it. The audience of neighbors who had been watching eagerly from behind curtains and porch railings began to realize this wasn't the tidy drama Karen had promised them. Instead of a public shaming of rule breakers, it was turning into a spectacle of her own undoing. My wife didn't need to raise her voice or make threats. Her presence was enough. With the weight of her position quietly backing her, she stood as a stark reminder that the HOA's power was limited, confined to paperwork and nuisance fines. But Karen wasn't ready to give up. She doubled down, insisting that the community had rules, that no one was above them, not even someone flashing a shiny badge. To her, this was personal vindication slipping through her fingers, and she couldn't let it go. The officers, now visibly uncomfortable, did their best to de-escalate. They explained in cautious tones that this was a civil matter, not a criminal one, and that the HOA would need to pursue its grievances through proper channels. Karen didn't want to hear it. She stamped her foot like a child denied a toy, her voice echoing across the quiet lakefront. Neighbors who had once cheered her crusade now began to murmur among themselves, uneasy with the scene unraveling before them. What had started as a show of strength was morphing into a display of desperation. It was in this moment that my wife finally chose to speak, not with threats, not with grand declarations, but with a measured calm that cut through the noise. She reminded the officers that she was on her own property, tending to her own affairs, and that any further disruption without cause could be considered harassment. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was undeniable. The officers nodded, taking her side without hesitation. Karen, on the other hand, looked like she had been struck. The facade of power she had built so carefully was crumbling. She had depended on fear, on intimidation, on the assumption that no one would dare stand up to her relentless enforcement. But now, confronted with someone who not only stood up to her but held genuine authority, she found herself exposed. The officers began packing up, muttering polite apologies to my wife, their demeanor softened with respect. Karen's shrill protests echoed uselessly as the patrol cars backed out of the gravel drive and disappeared down the lane, and just like that, she was left standing alone. The neighbors who had been watching quickly ducked back inside, embarrassed to have witnessed her defeat. My wife turned away, calm as ever, and carried her groceries into the cabin as though nothing had happened. But the incident left an unmistakable mark. It was more than just a clash over a lock. It was a battle of authority, and Karen had lost spectacularly. Yet if there was one thing we had learned about her, it was that she didn't take humiliation well. Defeat only fueled her fire. That night, she began plotting her next move, determined to reclaim the power she believed had been stolen from her. While the lake settled back into its usual quiet, she was already drafting letters, making phone calls, and whispering to anyone who would listen about how the community was in danger from outsiders who didn't respect the rules. She painted herself as the lone defender of order, twisting the story to hide her public embarrassment. For my wife and me, the cabin became more than just a retreat. It became the center of a storm we hadn't asked for but could no longer avoid. Each visit carried a new sense of tension, a new awareness that Karen's eyes were always watching, her schemes always brewing. The lock had become a symbol of defiance, not just against her, but against the overreach of an association that had forgotten its purpose. And so, while Karen schemed in the shadows, my wife quietly prepared for the battles ahead. She didn't boast about her badge or flaunt her position. Instead, she carried herself with the same quiet authority that had ended the standoff with the police. She knew the HOA would come again, perhaps with new tactics, perhaps with even more desperate attempts to corner us. But she also knew that this wasn't just about a lock anymore. It was about control, about freedom, about standing firm against those who thought they could bend others to their will through fear and manipulation. And in that sense, the battle for the cabin was only beginning. Karen had made her move, and my wife had countered. But the game was far from over. Because when people like Karen lose, they don't walk away. They double down. And the next chapter of this conflict would prove just how far she was willing to go. The lakefront community had a way of swallowing secrets. Whispers traveled quickly along the winding roads, carried by neighbors who loved nothing more than a juicy piece of gossip. By the end of the week, the story of Karen's failed police stunt had reached every porch, every kitchen table, and every backyard gathering spot in the HOA's jurisdiction. Some retold it with embarrassment, others with quiet amusement, and still others with relief that someone had finally stood up to her. But Karen herself refused to accept defeat. She had lived in the neighborhood long enough to cultivate a reputation as its self-appointed enforcer, and she wasn't about to let that crumble because of a single miscalculation. To her, the badge, my wife flashed, was not a symbol of authority to be respected. It was an obstacle to be overcome. And Karen wasn't the kind of person who retreated. She doubled down, transforming her humiliation into fuel for a new wave of hostility. The next strike came in the form of letters, thick, official-looking envelopes stuffed with citations, fines, and threats of legal action. Karen had mobilized the HOA board, twisting the narrative so that the lock became part of a larger story about community standards being undermined by non-compliant residents. Suddenly, the lock wasn't just a lock. According to her, it represented a dangerous precedent that could lead to chaos if not addressed. If one family could defy the HOA, what would stop others from repainting their cabins, altering their docks, or installing unapproved fixtures? The board, made up of neighbors who either feared Karen or relied on her to fight their petty battles, lined up behind her. They sent notice after notice, each one dripping with manufactured urgency. My wife kept them all, filing them neatly into a growing folder, her patience never wavering. To her, the letters were a nuisance, nothing more. But to the HOA, they were weapons, carefully designed to push us into compliance. It didn't stop there. Karen began recruiting allies, whispering to anyone who would listen that we were dangerous outsiders trying to undermine the community. She played the victim, spinning the police incident as a case of intimidation, claiming my wife had threatened her with federal power. The truth was twisted beyond recognition, but Karen didn't care. She only cared about one thing: regaining control. Soon, the pressure began to show in more subtle ways. The cabin's driveway was mysteriously blocked one morning by a pile of gravel, dumped by a construction crew who claimed they had been misdirected. A few days later, trash cans we had left neatly by the road were found tipped over, their contents scattered across the yard. Each incident was small enough to dismiss as coincidence, but the pattern was clear. Karen was testing us, probing for weaknesses, hoping we would snap under the constant harassment. But my wife wasn't built to bend. She had faced bigger challenges in her career than an overzealous HOA, and she understood the value of patience. Instead of reacting with anger, she documented everything. Every letter, every fine, every suspicious incident was recorded and filed away. She knew that power wasn't just about authority, it was about preparation. And while Karen thought she was tightening her grip, she was, in reality, building a case against herself. The neighbors, too, began to shift. Some, tired of Karen's endless crusades, quietly began to side with us. They offered nods of encouragement when they saw my wife at the local store or whispered words of support when Karen wasn't around. Others remained firmly in Karen's camp, eager to see her maintain her reign of control. The community was dividing, and the lock on our cabin door had become a symbol of rebellion, a line drawn in the sand. The tipping point came at the next HOA meeting. Karen, still stung by her public humiliation, arrived armed with binders of documents and a fire in her eyes. She demanded that the board take formal legal action against us, insisting that the integrity of the entire community depended on it. My wife, having anticipated the ambush, attended the meeting herself. She didn't sit quietly in the back as Karen expected. Instead, she took a seat at the front, calm and composed, her folder of meticulously documented evidence at her side. The meeting began with Karen's tirade. She painted us as lawless troublemakers, accused us of undermining the community, and presented the lock as proof of our disregard for the rules. She spoke with passion, her words dripping with self-righteousness. And for a while it seemed she might sway the room. Heads nodded. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, and the board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But then my wife stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't rant or accuse. She simply laid out the facts. She presented the timeline of harassment, the stack of letters, the baseless fines, and the pattern of petty retaliation. She reminded the room that the HOA's purpose was to maintain the community, not to serve as a tool for personal vendettas. Her words were measured, but the weight behind them was undeniable. And when she revealed her badge, not as a weapon, but as a quiet reminder of her credibility, the room fell silent. For the first time, Karen's grip on the community began to loosen. Some of her supporters shifted uncomfortably, realizing that they had hitched themselves to a cause that might not hold up under scrutiny. Others avoided her gaze entirely, unwilling to be associated with the spectacle she had created. The board, caught between loyalty to their enforcer and the undeniable weight of my wife's evidence, hesitated. Karen, however, refused to back down. She lashed out, accusing my wife of manipulation, of using her position to intimidate and silence her. But the more she ranted, the more the crowd turned against her. What had once been seen as strength now looked like desperation, and in that moment, Karen crossed a line she couldn't uncross. She threatened to take matters into her own hands, to fix the problem herself if the board refused to act. The threat hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. The board quickly adjourned the meeting, desperate to avoid further chaos. But the damage was done. Karen had revealed the lengths she was willing to go, and the neighbors who had once feared her now saw her for what she was. A woman consumed by obsession, willing to tear apart the community just to prove she was right. As the crowd dispersed, whispers filled the air. Some spoke of supporting us openly, others of distancing themselves from Karen. My wife walked out of the meeting calm as ever, but she knew what was coming. Karen wasn't done. If anything, she was more dangerous now than ever before. Because when someone like Karen loses their grip, they don't let go quietly. They claw, they scheme, they escalate. And by threatening to take matters into her own hands, she had declared that the battle for the cabin was far from over. What neither of us knew then was just how far she was willing to go, or how deeply. This feud would reshape not just the community, but the very fabric of the quiet life we had tried so hard to build at the lake. The weeks after the HOA meeting felt uneasy, as if the entire lakefront community was holding its breath. On the surface, things looked calm. The water shimmered in the sunlight, children laughed on the docks, and families enjoyed their weekend. Barbecues. But beneath that quiet, everyone knew something had shifted. Karen had been exposed, her mask of authority cracked for all to see. Yet instead of retreating, she grew more unpredictable. She stopped pretending to be subtle. Where once she lurked with her notepad and camera, she now stood openly in our driveway, glaring at the cabin door as though the lock itself were a personal insult. She cornered neighbors on their porches, warning them that my wife and I were dangerous and that the community needed to rally against us. Her tone carried the zeal of someone who believed she was fighting a holy war, and though many brushed her off, enough nodded along to embolden her. The harassment took a new turn. It was no longer about fines or letters. Karen had realized that paper alone couldn't defeat us, so she began testing boundaries in physical ways. One morning, we arrived to find a smear of paint across the cabin's front steps, thick red strokes that stood out garishly against the weathered wood. Another time, the lock itself had been tampered with, the keyhole scratched and gouged as if someone had tried to force it open. Nothing was stolen, nothing broken beyond repair, but the message was clear. She wanted us to feel unsafe. Neighbors whispered, some sympathetic, others cautious. They had seen Karen cross lines before, but this was different. She was no longer enforcing rules. She was waging a personal war. My wife, however, remained calm. She documented each incident, photographed every smear of paint, every scratch on the lock, every tipped-over trash can. She treated it not as intimidation, but as evidence, knowing that eventually Karen's behavior would speak louder than anything she could say. But Karen wasn't finished. If intimidation couldn't break us, she would escalate further. She began weaponizing the board itself, pushing for an emergency vote to strip us of cabin privileges. She argued that we were a liability, claiming we had created a hostile environment. It was a bold move, one that forced the board to choose between their enforcer and the community's growing unrest. For the first time, cracks began to show. Board members hesitated, wary of aligning themselves too closely with someone so obviously unhinged. Still, they didn't act against her, afraid of what she might do if cornered completely. That fear was not misplaced, because one late Friday evening, just as the sun dipped below the tree line and shadows stretched long across the water, Karen made her boldest move yet. My wife had arrived at the cabin ahead of me, preparing for the weekend. She was inside unpacking groceries when she heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravel drive. At first, she assumed it was me, arriving later than planned. But when she looked out the window, she saw Karen standing there, holding a clipboard in one hand and a flashlight. In the other, her expression hard and determined. Karen didn't knock. She didn't call out. She simply walked up the steps and tried the doorknob. Finding it locked, she rattled it violently, then stepped back and stared at the new lock as though it were mocking her. For a moment, she scribbled something onto her clipboard. Then, with startling audacity, she reached into her bag and pulled out a set of tools, slim metal picks that glinted in the fading light. She was trying to break in. My wife froze, watching through the slats of the blinds, her mind calculating quickly. She could have stormed out right then, badge in hand, and ended it, but instead she chose patience. She let Karen dig her own grave. She retrieved her phone, recorded every movement, every attempt at the door, every frustrated glance Karen threw over her shoulder. The evidence was undeniable, no longer a matter of he said, she said, but cold, hard proof. When Karen finally realized the lock wouldn't yield, she hissed under her breath, shoved the tools back into her bag, and stormed off into the night. My wife waited until she was gone before stepping outside, her camera still recording. She filmed the scratches on the lock, the fresh footprints in the gravel, and the clipboard Karen had accidentally dropped in her haste. On it were pages of notes, obsessively detailed accounts of our comings and goings, times we arrived, times we left, even what groceries my wife had carried inside. It was more than harassment now, it was stalking. The next morning, my wife presented the evidence to the local authorities. Unlike before, when Karen had weaponized the police for her own ends, this time the tables had turned. The officers who reviewed the footage were stunned. They had dealt with Karen's complaints often enough to know her reputation, but seeing her caught in the act was another matter entirely. They promised an investigation, though even then, they treaded carefully. HOA disputes were messy, and Karen still had allies who were quick to defend her as misunderstood. But my wife knew better. Karen wasn't misunderstood. She was escalating, and escalation rarely stopped without consequence. In the following days, tension rippled through the community. Some neighbors avoided eye contact, unwilling to take sides. Others began to distance themselves from Karen openly, whispering that she had gone too far this time. Still, she carried herself with defiance, strutting down the lanes with her clipboard, as if nothing had changed. She even cornered one neighbor, insisting that the footage was fabricated, a smear campaign designed to silence her. But the cracks were showing. Her once unshakable authority was eroding. For us, though, the reality was unavoidable. The cabin was no longer just a place of peace. It was ground zero for a battle that had spiraled out of control. My wife kept. Her calm exterior but I could see the way she checked the locks twice at night, the way her eyes scanned the tree line when we sat by the water. She wasn't afraid. Fear wasn't in her nature, but she was alert, calculating, ready for whatever might come next. Karen, on the other hand, was cornered, and cornered people rarely surrender quietly. If the lock had been the spark, this was now a blaze she couldn't contain. She had made it personal, and she wasn't going to stop until she either reclaimed her power or lost everything trying. The community sensed it too. Conversations grew hushed, glances sharper. Everyone knew a confrontation was coming, one that would decide not just the fate of the lock, but the balance of power within the entire HOA. Karen had declared war, and my wife was the immovable object, standing in her way. And as night settled over the lake once more, the sense of unease deepened. Something was building, something inevitable. The storm was no longer on the horizon. It was here. By the time autumn settled over the lake, the battle lines in the community had been drawn. The leaves turned red and gold, drifting across the docks and driveways, but the beauty of the season did nothing to soften the tension. Neighbors who once waved warmly now chose their gestures carefully, conscious of which side they might appear to support. The HOA, once a background nuisance of letters and reminders, had become the very center of life at the lake, its authority questioned, its purpose eroded. And at the center of it all stood Karen, more determined and more dangerous than ever. The footage of her attempted break-in had circulated quietly. My wife hadn't made a spectacle of it, but word spread quickly in a community as tight-knit as ours. Some residents were horrified. Others, loyal to Karen, dismissed it as an exaggeration or a misunderstanding. Karen herself denied it completely, insisting the video was doctored and that she had been framed by outsiders trying to tarnish her good name. But the denial rang hollow. Too many people had seen the truth with their own eyes. Still, instead of backing down, Karen grew more brazen. She began showing up at the cabin at odd hours, lingering near the property line, pretending to inspect the area for HOA violations. She left notices tucked under windshield wipers accusing us of infractions that were laughably minor, leaves not raked to standard, grass trimmed at the wrong length, even excessive decorative pumpkins on the porch during Halloween. Each notice was absurd, but it wasn't about rules anymore. It was about control, about reminding us that she was still there, still watching. The board, meanwhile, was fracturing. Half of them wanted to distance themselves from her entirely, fearing her behavior would drag the HOA into lawsuits. The other half were still too afraid of her wrath to act decisively. Meetings devolved into shouting matches, with Karen storming out in anger when her motions were tabled. The once unified, if overbearing association was now a house divided, its authority crumbling from within. For us, the harassment had become routine. My wife documented everything, building a case brick by brick. Every petty citation, every trespass, every whispered threat was cataloged with the precision of someone who understood the long game. She never showed anger, never stooped to Karen's level. She remained calm, methodical, and patient. But I could see the toll it was taking. The cabin, once our refuge, was now a battleground. Nights that should have been filled with laughter. Around the fireplace were spent double-checking locks and reviewing camera footage. The breaking point came on a cold November evening. The lake was quiet, most families having left for the season, but we stayed behind to enjoy the solitude. My wife had just settled into her chair with a book when a noise outside shattered the silence. A low rumble, the unmistakable growl of engines. She stepped to the window and froze. A convoy of trucks rolled slowly down the gravel lane, their headlights cutting through the darkness. At least half a dozen of them, each one packed with figures in dark jackets, their faces obscured by caps and scarves. Karen walked in front, clipboard in hand, her silhouette illuminated by the beams of the trucks. She had gathered reinforcements, not from the HOA board this time, but from outside. People we didn't recognize, rougher, louder, the kind of company she must have believed would intimidate us into submission. They spilled out of the trucks, stomping across the driveway, muttering among themselves as Karen directed them like a general leading her troops. She had crossed a line. This wasn't about fines or rules anymore. This was intimidation in its rawest form. My wife stood at the window, calm as ever, but I could see the flicker in her eyes, the calculation, the weighing of choices. She reached for her phone, not to call me or even the police, but to record once again. Evidence, always evidence. The group circled the cabin, shining flashlights into the windows, pounding on the walls, laughing crudely as Karen shouted accusations about rule-breaking and non-compliance. It was chaos, loud and menacing, a display designed to rattle us. But my wife didn't flinch. She let them perform their theater, all the while capturing every moment on video. Eventually, one of the men tried the door, rattling the new lock that had caused so much turmoil. Karen barked at him to step aside, declaring that the HOA had authority to enter and inspect. That was the moment my wife moved. She stepped outside, badge in hand, her posture steady, her voice calm but commanding. The scene shifted instantly. The men froze, their laughter dying in their throats as the reality of what they were facing sank in. This wasn't just a homeowner. This was a federal agent, and their little show had just crossed into criminal territory. Karen sputtered, insisting that the badge meant nothing here, that community rules were above outside authority. But even her hired muscle wasn't buying it. They shuffled uneasily, muttering among themselves, some already backing toward their trucks. My wife didn't raise her voice or make threats. She simply stated with quiet authority that every second of their actions had been recorded, and that harassment, trespassing, and attempted forced entry carried serious consequences. The men weren't loyal to Karen. They were loyal to their own self-preservation. Within minutes, engines roared back to life as trucks peeled away into the night, leaving Karen standing alone in the driveway. Her face twisted with rage and humiliation. She hurled insults, calling my wife a fraud, a bully, an outsider who would never belong. But her words carried no weight anymore. Her army had abandoned her, her power slipping through her fingers, like water. When the last tail light disappeared into the darkness, my wife turned and went back inside, calm as ever. She didn't celebrate, didn't gloat. She simply filed the footage, another piece of evidence in a growing mountain. But I knew what she was thinking. Karen wasn't finished. Not yet. People like her didn't stop until they were forced to. And the next move, whatever it was, would be desperate. The community awoke the next morning buzzing with whispers. Some had heard the trucks, others had seen them rumble past their houses. The story spread quickly, and for the first time, Karen's supporters faltered. It was one thing to send fines and letters. It was another to bring in outsiders to intimidate a neighbor. That crossed a line too bold to ignore. The board called an emergency meeting, not to punish us, but to discuss what to do about her. Still, Karen carried herself with defiance. She stormed into the meeting, slamming her clipboard on the table, demanding that the board back her up. But the room had shifted. Neighbors who once nodded along to her tirades now sat in silence, eyes averted. Others openly challenged her, asking how far she was willing to drag the community down for her personal vendetta. Karen ranted, shouted, accused everyone of betrayal. By the end, she was alone at the table, her voice echoing in a room that no longer supported her. But isolation didn't mean surrender. It meant escalation. And as she stormed out of the meeting, swearing that she would handle things her way, it became clear to everyone that the end was near. Karen had burned her bridges, and whatever came next would decide not just the fate of our cabin, but the fate of the HOA itself. The storm had reached its peak, and all that remained was the inevitable clash that would bring everything crashing down. The morning after the emergency board meeting, the air around the lake felt charged, heavy with the sense that something irreversible was about to happen. The community had reached its breaking point. For years, the HOA had been a force of quiet, irritation, a background hum of fines and rules that people endured for the sake of order. But Karen had taken that irritation and turned it into obsession, and now her crusade was dragging everyone into chaos. Neighbors whispered openly. Some gathered in small groups on their porches, debating whether the board should dissolve entirely. Others fretted over Karen's growing unpredictability, worried she might lash out in ways that went beyond HOA politics. Children who once played freely along the gravel roads now stayed closer to home, their parents keeping watchful eyes on the tree line. The lake itself, usually serene, mirrored the tension, its surface dark and restless under a low-hanging sky. My wife sensed it too. She rose earlier than usual, double-checked the locks, and walked the property line with the steady awareness of someone preparing for confrontation. She didn't say much, but I knew her mind was working through contingencies, every possible outcome mapped and planned. She was patient, but she also understood that patience alone wouldn't end this. Karen had crossed too many lines. Evidence was stacked against her, the community was turning, and the authorities were already watching closely. The only thing left was for her to make her final mistake. It came sooner than anyone expected. That evening, as the last light faded and a thin fog rolled in from the water, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed on the gravel. Karen appeared at the edge of the driveway, her figure half shrouded in mist. She carried no clipboard this time, no binder of rules or stack of citations. Instead, she held a crowbar in one hand, her knuckles white against the metal. Her face was pale, twisted with fury and desperation, the mask of neighborhood enforcer stripped away to reveal the raw obsession beneath. She didn't bother with pretense. She marched straight up the steps of the cabin and raised the crowbar. Against the lock, her voice ringing out into the quiet, shouting about justice, about rules, about how she would not be made a fool. The blows echoed, sharp and violent, splintering the night air. But Karen wasn't alone. Lights flickered on across the lake as neighbors stepped onto porches, drawn by the noise. Some filmed from their phones, others simply watched, stunned. As the woman who had once ruled the HOA with an iron grip descended into madness before their eyes. The board president himself appeared from his house down the lane, his expression grim as he hurried toward the scene. Inside, my wife remained calm. She let Karen strike. Let the cameras capture every desperate swing, every shouted word. Then, when the moment was right, she opened the door. The cabin light spilled across the steps, illuminating her silhouette. She stood tall, her badge in hand, her voice carrying with quiet authority as she commanded Karen to stop. The effect was immediate. The crowbar clattered against the wood as Karen froze, her wild eyes darting between my wife, the badge, and the growing crowd of neighbors. For the first time, she seemed to realize how far she had gone, but it was too late. The board president stepped forward, his voice breaking the silence. He declared, loud enough for all to hear, that Karen's actions were not sanctioned, that she no longer represented the HOA in any capacity. He condemned the harassment, the intimidation, the attempted break-ins. His words, spoken with the weight of authority, severed her last thread of power. The neighbors who had once feared her now watched with pity, even disgust. The spell was broken. Karen stammered, tried to defend herself, but the words rang hollow. Her allies were gone, her credibility shattered. The officers arrived moments later, summoned by neighbors who had called the moment the crowbar appeared. They didn't hesitate this time. They reviewed the evidence, my wife's recordings, The neighbor's videos, the fresh dents in the lock, and placed Karen in handcuffs. She protested, shrieking about conspiracies, about betrayal, but her words carried no weight anymore. The sight of her being led down the driveway, flanked by flashing lights, was surreal. For years, she had ruled through intimidation and fear, her clipboard a weapon as sharp as any blade. Now she was just a woman undone by her own obsession, her empire of fines and threats crumbling behind her. The community exhaled in unison. Neighbors stepped forward, some thanking my wife quietly, others simply relieved that the nightmare was finally over. The board, shaken but resolute, announced in the days that followed that reforms would be made. No longer would a single individual be allowed unchecked authority. Rules would be reviewed, power balanced, and transparency enforced. For the first time in years, there was hope that the HOA might serve its true purpose, maintaining the community, not controlling it. For us, the cabin regained its peace. The lock, still dented but unbroken, stood as a symbol of defiance, a reminder that standing firm against intimidation was worth every sleepless night, every confrontation. My wife, ever steady, tucked away the evidence folder for good, not out of fear that it might be needed again, but as a record of a battle won not with anger, but with patience, preparation, and quiet strength. Karen's name lingered in whispers. For a while, her downfall a story retold around campfires and dinner tables. Some pitied her, others mocked her, but all agreed she had only herself to blame. Eventually, her house went dark, her presence gone from the lakefront entirely. She became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when power turns to obsession. And so, as winter came and the first snow fell across the water, the cabin returned to what it had always been, a refuge. The laughter of family gatherings filled its rooms once more. The warmth of the fireplace replaced the chill of conflict, and the lock on the front door stood strong, untouched, a quiet monument to resilience. The storm had passed. The lake was calm again, and the chapter of Karen's reign was finally mercifully closed.